مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. كان ذلك اليوم سافيا ومشرقا، بالكاد كانت هناك سحابة في السماء الزرقاء الساطعة. كان صباح يوم ثلاثاء مثل أي صباح يوم ثلاثاء آخر، حيث وصل الأولاد إلى المدارس وألقى الأهل في القطارات الأنفاق، وكان الملايين يسرعون بالذهاب من منازلهم إلى وظائفهم كما فعلوا يوم الاثنين، لكنهم لم يفعلوا ذلك يوم الأربعاء. لأن يوم الثلاثاء كان 11 من سبتمبر 2001، وهو اليوم الذي غير أمريكا. بعد 20 عاما ما زالت أحداث ذلك اليوم الرهيبة تهز السياسة الأمريكية والخارجية والأمن. في الواقع، بينما نستعد لإحياء الذكرى السنوية 20 لتلك الهجمات، فإننا نشعر الآن بالحزن على فقدان المزيد من الأمريكيين الذين قتلوا في البلد التي رسم فيها أسامة بن لادن مخطوطه الشريف. جو بايدن هو رابع رئيس يتولى السلطة في عصر 11 من سبتمبر. يريد أن يكون الأخير. هو يهدف وبدلا من أن تركز أمتنا على المحاربة الإرهاب، يريدها أن تركز على منافسة الأعداء الكبار وخاصة الصين. ولكن كما يقول المثل، يحق للإرهابيين التصويت. لمناقشة ما حدث في يوم الثلاثاء المزعوم ذلك، ولمناقشة القرارات الرئيسية التي اتخذها الرئيس جورج دبليو بوش في ذلك اليوم، والآثار التي لا تزال تؤثر في حياتنا اليوم. يسعدني أن أرحب بكبير موظفي البيت الأبيض الجدير بالاحترام أندرو كارد. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. It's 20 years, 2 decades since September 11th, 2001. And once again, the issues that stopped America in its tracks are in the headlines: Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, attacks on Americans. To talk about what happened that fateful day and where we are as a nation 20 years later, I am pleased and privileged to welcome Secretary Andrew Card, Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush. Secretary Card, thank you very much for joining us today.
Rob, it's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you for inviting me to make sure people keep the promises that many of us made, which was never to forget what happened on September 11th, 2001.
Thank you very much. So let's start with a core question, and then we'll go back in time. Two dominant realities. We've had 2 decades of no major terrorist attacks on American soil, a great success. And then we've also seen the Taliban retake control of Afghanistan, shall we say less than a success. In your view, who won the war on terror?
Well, I have to give credit to our forces in the military and the intelligence community, as well as all of the remarkable allies that helped us in Afghanistan. But for literally 20 years, Afghanistan was not a place where attacks or terrorist attacks were planned or executed on America and our allies. We had a remarkable track record, and I think our service members, our intelligence community, and the remarkable allies that stood with us in the battles in Afghanistan for actually winning the war in terms of keeping us safe. That doesn't mean that the transfer of power and the hoped for democratization of Afghanistan went as we wanted. But I do not view our leaving Afghanistan as if we are leaving in defeat. No, the men and women who made sacrifices there did not sacrifice in vain. They kept the mission. They met the mission obligations to make sure that no attacks could be carried out from Afghanistan by terrorists that were harbored in that nation for 20 years. So it's a remarkable track record. In terms of passing the baton to a democratically elected government, clearly that has not worked, and I'm frustrated by the process that has been taking place over the last several weeks as we pull out of Afghanistan. But I do not want to diminish the remarkable contributions made by so many men and women in our armed forces, the intelligence community, in the USAID community, the State Department teams, the NGOs, and those of our remarkable allies from NATO, European nations, and others all around the world. There were truly, I think about 97 countries ended up contributing significantly to the ability to make sure that Afghanistan would not foment bad actions against democracies around the world and other governments around the world, and they succeeded for 20 years.
All right, very good. So let's go back in time, Secretary Card, September 11th, 2001. Where were you at 8:46 a.m. that Tuesday morning?
I was in an elementary school, the Emma E. Booker School in Sarasota, Florida, and the president was getting ready to read a book with second graders in a classroom. And we were standing at a door to the classroom when the president, with the principal of the school, was getting ready to go into the classroom to sit in a chair in front of these second graders and in front of a press pool and listen and to students, ask them questions, and then read a book with them. And it was supposed to be an easy day. I remember telling the president when he got up in the morning, it's going to be an easy day. You're doing your favorite thing. You'll be talking about leaving no child behind in education and getting rid of the soft bigotry of low expectation in education. So I said it was going to be an easy day. As the president was getting ready to walk into that classroom with the principal, the three of us were standing at the door to the classroom when a Navy captain by the name of Deb Lauer, who was the acting national security advisor on the trip to Florida and the director of the White House Situation Room, she came to the president and said, "Sir, it appears a small twin-engine prop plane crashed into one of the towers at the World Trade Center in New York City." The president, the principal, and I all had the same reaction. Oh, what a horrible accident. The pilot must have had a heart attack or something. It was actually verbalized. And then the principal of the school opened the door to the classroom, and she and the president went into the classroom. The door shut. I was still in the holding room. And Captain Lauer came up to me and said, "Sir, it appears it was not a small twin-engine prop plane. It was a commercial jetliner." My mind flashed to the fear the passengers on the plane must have had, because the plane must have been losing altitude. I don't know why that's where my mind went, but that's where it went. But that was only a nanosecond, because Captain Lauer came up to me and said, "Sir, it appears it was not a small twin-engine prop plane. It was a commercial jetliner." And oh my God, another plane hit the other tower at the World Trade Center. And that's when I knew that we were in deep trouble. And my mind did flash to three initials, UBL, Osama bin Laden. I knew about Al-Qaeda. I knew about the attacks on the World Trade Center in 1993, January of 93. So I decided then that I should pass a test. Does the president need to know? Yes. And what am I going to say to him? I thought about my words. I knew that he was sitting in front of a press pool in front of second graders. I presumed he had a boom microphone over his forehead, so I didn't want to have a dialogue with him. But I carefully decided what I would say. I opened the door to the classroom, stepped in. The teacher was conducting a dialogue between the students and the president. I didn't want to interrupt that. The president did not see me come into the room. I came in from behind him. When the teacher told the students to take out their books is when I walked up to the president and leaned over and whispered into his right ear. And he never really turned around to talk to me, but I leaned over and whispered into his right ear, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." I then stood back from him so that he couldn't ask me a question and start a dialogue. I then went back to the door of the holding room, again looked at the president. I saw his head bobbing up and down. I saw the students having pulled out their books, being very attentive to their books, being very, very well behaved. And I noticed the press pool, all of the reporters had turned around and were talking to Ari Fleischer. They weren't looking at the president. I then stepped into the holding room and said, get the FBI director on the phone, get a line open to the vice president, get a line open to the White House Situation Room, get the crew back on Air Force One, get the Secret Service to turn the motorcade around. We're going to have to leave. And to a communications official named Dan Bartlett, I said, get some remarks written for the president. We've got 600 people in the gymnasium, and he cannot say anything to them that we do not know to be the truth. And then the president walked into the holding room, and the first thing he said after everybody, Mr. President, Mr. President, Mr. President, he said, get the FBI director on the phone. And we could say he's right here. It was Bob Mueller, and he'd only been the FBI director for about 10 days.
And you very quickly realized that this was Al-Qaeda, the group that had attacked America outside the country, but not yet inside the country.
I did. I knew about Al-Qaeda. I knew about the attacks on the World Trade Center during the Clinton administration. So it was, yes. And oh, do I wish we had had better intelligence and could have done something to prevent the attack. But America rallied that day, and the whole world rallied. And I was a witness to President Bush meeting his responsibilities. You know, I say this not facetiously, I say it sincerely. I really believe September 11th, 2001, when I whispered into the president's ear, was the day that he realized the burden of being a president. It's to keep that oath, whether you say, I promise to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. And so I think the president became the president when I whispered in his ear and told him that America was under attack. And so his priority had to be keeping his oath of office. It couldn't be his wish list. He had to do his duty. And so I witnessed him step up to that responsibility, and he did a remarkable job on September 11th, but also in the subsequent days, helping to build a coalition of people around the globe. And he changed American foreign policy in a speech that he gave that night, a very brief remark from the Oval Office, when he basically said to world leaders, you're either with us or against us. You can't harbor terrorists and not be just as guilty as the terrorists. So don't harbor any terrorists. And I know many leaders around the world squirmed in their seats as they would listen to that challenge. But I remember Muammar Gaddafi was one of the first leaders who stepped up and said, oh, I'm with you. I'm with you. We are not your enemy on this one. And so I know General Musharraf in Pakistan was probably squirming in his seat and said, I want to be with you, but I also don't want to be with you. But it was a dramatic time, and President Bush stepped up to meet the responsibilities and put together a remarkable coalition. And I have to give a shout out to many of our Middle Eastern friends who stepped up and have helped, but also Great Britain and Germany really did a remarkable job. The British really was spectacular in working with President Bush to help mitigate the problems of terrorist attacks around the world.
So obviously the immediate need was to secure American cities, American airspace. At what point did the discussion turn among senior officials to how and where do we respond? What were the original considerations?
Well, even on the plane ride from Sarasota, Florida, eventually back to Washington, D.C. with stops in Louisiana and then a stop in Strategic Air Command in Omaha, Nebraska before we get back to Washington, D.C. We were told by the CIA that they were pretty sure that it was Al-Qaeda that had conducted the attack and Osama bin Laden. And so we knew that this had been fomented outside the country. Obviously, it was carried out from within our country. And that was something that no one anticipated. At least I'm not aware of anyone who anticipated that happening. So it was a very scary time, and we were a bit paranoid as to whether or not another attack was imminent, and would it be in Los Angeles or San Francisco or Chicago or Dallas or Orlando, Florida or something. So we were very attentive to every rumor or innuendo and concern. And yes, there is going to be justice. And the president actually said something like that when he addressed the parents and community members in Sarasota, Florida, after I whispered into his ear and he went into that gymnasium to talk to the folks before he got on Air Force One to leave. But I remember the plane ride out of Sarasota included conversations with Mike Morrell, the CIA briefer for the president, who was on the trip. And he said he was pretty sure it was Al-Qaeda. He talked to folks back at the CIA and they told us that it was Al-Qaeda. So, and we knew that we were going to have to deal with an effort to make sure that they couldn't do it again, and there had to be a consequence, and justice would have to be done.
As you said a moment ago, fighting terror wasn't President Bush's original top priority, but it certainly became that top priority. When we come back after the break, we're going to talk about that shift in priorities and how the goals evolved throughout your term in the White House and where we are today, how far we've come along on that path over these past 20 years. In just a moment. There are few dates on the calendar that are themselves so hallowed that the date alone tells the story. July 4th, December 7th, September 11th. An entire generation has been born since the terrible events of that brilliantly clear Tuesday morning, when 3,000 innocents were killed in a plot to weaponize civilian airliners, ramming them into iconic symbols of American strength and power, the World Trade Centers in New York and the Pentagon in Virginia, with one plot to target the White House, stopped by a selflessly courageous group of passengers who brought a jetliner down in Pennsylvania rather than allow it to finish its mission. I was in Manhattan that fateful day and saw out of the south-facing window of the 36th floor of Rockefeller Tower the puff of smoke of the first plane hitting that tower at the southern tip of the island. I was fortunate, but along with 300 million Americans, I will never forget the day when hate and evil born in the Middle East came to our shores. May the memory of those who perished, the victims, and the brave firefighters and first responders who jumped at the call to help them forever be a blessing. Again, my guest today is Secretary Andrew Card Jr. Andy Card played a central role at a key moment in the history of our nation and the world. A native of Massachusetts who had previously served in the cabinet of President George H.W. Bush, he is best known for being White House Chief of Staff and Chief Aide to President George W. Bush that fateful morning in September 2001 when the World Trade Center was attacked by Al-Qaeda. He continued to serve for 5 more years, one of the longest serving chiefs of staff in history. After leaving government, he led the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University and later served as president of Franklin Pierce University. So, as we were just saying, fighting terror wasn't President Bush's original objective, but he became a war president. When you look back on those early years, what were the wisest decisions you made in 2001, 2002? And if you don't mind, what were a couple for which you wish you had do-overs?
Well, first of all, George W. Bush came to the presidency, obviously having paid attention to his dad when he was president. And so his father was probably one of the greatest presidents in terms of being able to understand the challenges of the world and meet diplomacy's challenges. And obviously the first Gulf War happened under George H.W. Bush. So George W. Bush learned a lot from his dad. But when he became president, he was focusing on a domestic agenda for America, and he'd been governor of Texas, and he was not interested in as much foreign policy issues as his dad, and kind of took pride in the fact that he was going to focus on what was happening inside the United States rather than outside the United States. And he did not have the reputation of even having been a world traveler. So he had to climb a learning curve. He did. And I'm saying he was extremely disciplined about meeting the responsibilities as a leader when I recognized that we were under attack, and he knew what that meant. The first thing he did on Air Force One when we took off from Sarasota, Florida on the September 11th, 2001, he said he wanted to call President Putin and make sure President Putin knew what was going on in the United States and didn't overreact or think that the United States was using this as some way to attack Russia. And so nobody told him to do it. He did that on his own. I watched him really recognize that if the United States was going to be successful in mitigating the challenges of terrorism around the world, he had to have allies.
Secretary Andy Card, thank you so much for joining us on Dakhel, Washington, helping us remember what happened on September 11th, 2001, and bringing the story up 20 years to where we as a nation and the world are today. Thank you very much. We were all so much younger then, but 20 years still seems like yesterday. I remember every moment. My own story is this. I was in New York City for a quarterly meeting of my institute's board of directors. At 8:46 a.m., I emerged from the elevator on the 36th floor of Rockefeller Center where the meeting was being held. I turned toward the south-facing window of the office suite, and off in the distance, I saw a puff of smoke on the side of one of the two towers of the World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. I didn't think too much of it. A few minutes later, the meeting started, and shortly after that, the emergency alarm, ordering everyone in Rock Center to evacuate the giant complex. A second airplane had hit the other tower, and it was clear that America was under attack. Everything was mayhem. Our group moved down Fifth Avenue to a cafe in the University Club to watch the terrible drama unfold on a television screen. We frantically tried to call loved ones, especially those in harm's way, in Lower Manhattan and in Washington, a task complicated by the officious doorman at the University Club, who even in that frenzied moment insisted on enforcing rules against cell phone use inside the building. I finally got hold of my wife, who was herself evacuated from an office just 1 block away from the White House, target of the fourth plane, which we later learned was diverted through the selfless courage of its passengers. Later that day, I walked much of the length of an empty Fifth Avenue, devoid of cars, buses, and taxis, like in some dystopian science fiction film, except this was real life, the start of a new era. For more than a decade since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, we Americans had lived in a bubble, some even falling prey to a fallacy that we had witnessed the end of history. But history had a different idea, and so began the era of 9/11. The road from 9/11 took some twists and turns, to Afghanistan and then to Iraq, to faraway places like Guantanamo, to places closer to home like San Bernardino and Orlando. It produced leaders of wildly different ideas, personalities, and temperament, like Barack Obama and Donald Trump. But the basic question persists. Did we win the war on terror? We have prevented or deterred another mass casualty attack on American soil. So by that yardstick, the effort was successful. We left Afghanistan 20 years after 9/11, leaving in charge the same people who ruled the country and gave safe haven to the killers of that terrible day. So that's not easy to count as victory. Perhaps the question is itself misplaced. Like improving health, education, and the environment, I think we have learned that fighting terrorism is not a war that comes to an end. It is just something that we need to do and do well every day. That may be the most important lesson of all. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول التأثير الدائم للهجمات 11 من سبتمبر على السياسة والمجتمع الأمريكي، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.